Hello, hello, Mr. Trevor. Welcome to the second ever episode of Caution, Men at Work. And that relates to Next Gen Men's social enterprise equity leaders, which we both work and lead, advancing gender equity and broader kind of diversity and inclusion initiatives in male dominant workplaces. How are you today, Trev?
Oh, living the dream, Jake, as usual.
Well, we are going to jump into about a 30-minute conversation and end with a card for equity. But, last time I made a joke about alley oops, so I'll throw the lob and you'll dunk the jam here. What's on our mind right now is this story coming out of Toronto, the Toronto District School Board, more specifically about a principal who unfortunately died by suicide. And there's a lot of controversy about it. Obviously, someone taking their own life is a tragedy, but the reason the controversy is existing is that this principal took part in a anti-racist training, and there was a bit of debate, discussion that happened at that training, which he has some litigation going through the courts around causing emotional distress and those types of things, and then obviously the culmination of this individual taking their own life. I don't think we really want to get into like the nitty gritty of that, but obviously, we don't lead anti-racist training, but we lead gender equity training, diversity, equity, inclusion training, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion training, diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity training, whatever the heck you want to call it. That's kind of our wheelhouse. And I think it's really made us reflect on what is a productive space for these conversations in professional settings.
Yeah, this one really struck me, and I think it's something we see in a lot of the different workplaces we work into, and we work with, and clients and individuals. And it's right now is like, how do you actually have tough and difficult conversations in this area? They're super important. And is it the workplace the right place to have it? Does it need to happen outside? A lot of people see this as not sort of really germane to what their job description actually is. But I think it rolls back to me is like, if we're talking about social change, we're talking about evolution, we're talking about bringing people along on a journey. If we don't allow people to change and evolve, I mean, how do we actually sort of meet some of our goals in terms of the equity inclusion journey? The job is, and when I talk to clients about some of this stuff, I mean, it's about progress over perfection, and what does that actually mean when we have this conversation? And a lot of people come to the conversation and be like, well, I'm not going to say anything. I don't want to get in trouble, or I don't want my coworker to look at me and judge me and all that, because having these uncomfortable conversations in the workplace can feel quite daunting. And so the challenge a lot of people are having right now is they feel like they're talked to about these issues, that they're not brought along in the conversation. Maybe they don't see themselves in these conversations around equity. And primarily to focus on one maybe more specific demographic is a lot of white men feel like there's a lot of conversation happening right now, not only just in the workplace with DEI conversations, but I mean, social, political spaces, all these different entertainment, no matter where you turn, this conversation happening. And so they see the ground shifting, they see the world moving by them or past them. And now, granted, I can debate the context on which that's based, but that fear and that feeling, that upsetting, that scared, that frustration, or frankly, just the misunderstanding or not even understanding of what's happening is all very valid. Those feelings are very real. And so the conversation isn't, oh, you don't understand it, you don't get it, you're frustrated by it, or maybe there's some shame, some anger, some discomfort that comes along with that. It's not to go out behind the witch head and be shot and be done with. It's about saying, okay, you are allowed to stumble, you're allowed to have these conversations, we're allowed to push these things around a little bit. These are valid feelings to have, and then bring people along in these conversations. And I think that's something that's been missing from the conversation a fair bit in the workplace, is that we've started with this point of compliance. You will say this, you will not say this. This is our policy. This is what the new expectations are. Or we've had these policies on the books, but now we're actually going to start leaning into them, actually applying them. But we're not really talking about the caring, the compassion side of it, is where some of these soft skills, some of this understanding is new to people. And in order to adapt them and learn, we need to stumble a bit. We need to be challenged in that space. If someone comes up to me and says, "Hey, Trevor, I need you to learn a new web platform," or I need you to learn new software. Well, I need to practice that. You mean I don't just all of a sudden like go through a course and come out and be like, oh my gosh, I'm in Adobe. Like this also tells me how untech savvy I am. But I don't walk out being how to do that. Driving. You know what I mean? We go through driving tests. You have to go through the graduated phases. You have to go on course. You go with instructors, and like that is part of the process of learning, right?
Well, so let me offer what I think is maybe a more familiar parallel. Your partner is a Spanish speaker and you're learning Spanish, right? And if we likened, DEI conversations to learning a new language, seeing the world a new way, what kind of climate would exist if you learned, some of these absolutely new words and concepts to you in a space where your partner was just like, that's, you sound stupid, like you can't, you're not doing it right, you're, all these types of things, versus like, acknowledging, oh, you're trying to say this, but actually it comes like this, right? I always think about these as new skills. And I think the tough part, and this is why I think language is so interesting as a parallel around this. When you were talking, I was really thinking about the difference between learning and unlearning, right? And learning a new concept, great. There's nothing that exists in your mind space before that. But unlearning is taking some space in your mind where something exists and kind of removing that and supplanting it with new information. And when we put that language parallel on it, for us as English speakers, right, like we see the world through like an Anglophone lens, like I'm bilingual in another language, but neither here nor there, we see it through this lens. And when we're trying to speak Spanish and your partner like they've lived their whole life in a Spanish lens, right? And so I think when it comes to those like identity and justice-based issues, like I, as a white male, have lived my entire life with this lens, and someone who has a different identity can look at that and be like, how do you not see these things, right? But that's their kind of lived experience there. So I think we just need to create that space for the unlearning, and unlearning is hard. It's vulnerable. It requires us to acknowledge this thing that we believe to be true is not, or is harmful, or is unhelpful, and call in and kind of adjust and move from there.
It's interesting because when we go into workplaces, we see a lot of people just shut up. And because they don't want to say something, because they know that the ground is shifting, they know there's new things, and they may not understand it. They may not even know what isn't allowed to be said, and because they're not really sort of exploring it, and so they shut up. And
you'll never hablamos español if you shut up.
Well, here's the thing about that, is the fact that, like, to your point about that, I mean, like, I go through lessons I learn, but if I wasn't able to have sloppy, messy Spanish, I would never be able to learn Spanish. And I think that the important part about that, and this is where it parallels over to the workplace too, is if you genuinely are coming at it, your heart's in the right place. And if you're trying to do right by other people, and your heart is saying like, I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to do better, like, that is the difference between if I went in and was just being like, I am never learning Spanish, or I'm going to only have my 3 words in Spanish, you're going to come along with me, or I'm just going to have a terrible Spanish, I'm not trying to learn, I'm not trying to do better. Well, guess what? After a few years, people are going to be like, you haven't really tried. Your heart's not in it. You're not trying to meet me in my space, in my experience as well. And I think that's the difference. Now, granted, in the workplace, in your learning journey, you can't be actively harming and violent in that journey, right? Like, that's the important distinction, is you can't be like, oh, well, Earl's really trying, even though he's creating a wake of destruction behind them. So that needs to be sort of maintained and controlled there. But like, this is the pressure. If we all remember with Me Too, is when people, in response, men sort of flipped tables and said like, well, I'm just not going to have private meetings one-on-one with women anymore in my office, or I'm going to have a third party and all that. And so in this sort of context, to me, like, that was a fear-based response, or maybe it was like some people having a political response too. But that was a prime example of people not actually like taking the compliance side and not actually taking the caring side. Being like, people are not asking you to cancel your meetings. People aren't asking you to do that. We're just asking you to be a human and be safe and responsible in those meetings. You're not harassing men in your meetings. So replicate that over to other genders as well. And so for me, but dialing in on that though is when we chatted with male leaders specifically about that, there was fear there. There's people not understanding what the implications were. There was a challenge for people to say, what is my role? What's safe? What's not right? Like, how do we navigate this? And so for me, the failure was in a lot of the workplaces and leaders in the workplace having a conversation around this is what it looks like. This is what the learning journey looks like, in a real honest way. Well, not just saying, here's the compliance, but also recognizing that people do have like some messiness to go through to understand what the role is and practice it.
Yeah. And I think there's like a lack of good faith sometimes, right? Like going back to your Me Too example, it's not a light switch where either you have meetings with women or you turn it off and you don't have meetings with women, right? It's more like a dimmer, and we can get creative about it. And it's like, okay, like, you want to manage perceptions about this, have your mentorship meetings in a public place, cafe or a shared space in the workplace or those types of things. Or better yet, like, oh, I don't feel comfortable mentoring a woman one-on-one. Great, mentor two women, two on one, right? Like, uh, and again, like, I think you're right that it's like, just don't do it, right? Like, if you're not harassing men in the workplace, don't harass women in the workplace. Like that's the root of it. But I think to your point earlier around people just shutting up and not saying anything at all, that's not good faith, right? Good faith is really moving through and trying to find solutions to this perceived issue.
When we talk about like psychological safety, when people talk about safe spaces, which I think is a problematic term because like what's safe to me is not necessarily safe to you, and it may change from today to tomorrow. And so it's always evolving for everybody. So I think it's not necessarily the appropriate term to really define what we're trying to go for. But when we talk about creating these healthier, more successful, inclusive spaces, maybe one of the things that I think we leave out of that conversation is we want to make sure that it's safe and inclusive for individuals, marginalized identities who've been experiencing challenges and roadblocks and obstacles and harassment and the long list in the workplace. But if we're actually interested in creating change, sustainable cultural change in the organization, we also need to engage the individuals who either are, obviously the problematic individuals who are acting violent, but also the other people who don't understand or sit on the sidelines and not necessarily understanding what their role is in that. Because we've been doing a really good job of saying, here's what's okay and not okay, but we haven't actually explained to a lot of the other people who say, like, I'm not committing this, I'm not violent, I'm not doing blah, 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 about what their role is in this conversation. And so they hit eject, or they don't, they are silent, or they're fearful in terms of like stepping into the fray. I mean, we can find so many parallels. It's the same sort of thing, the bystander, what's it called? The bystander rule, right? Where like, thank you. Where like a lot of people sit by and be like, oh, someone else will do it. It's not my role. Like something's happening. Be like, oh, like so that was really weird, but like that's not my role. Well, we need to create the space for people to have the conversation with everybody in the workplace about culture setting. Like policies are not culture. People are culture. And so you can't just write a piece of paper and send it out and mail it up on your lunchroom and set it on the internet and think, okay, we did it, great. Like we now have XYZ culture. No, it's the people. And so if you're not bringing everybody along in that journey, and granted, there will be some people who are not part of the new vision and the values of the organization, and that will need to be dealt with. But if you're not bringing everybody along in terms of what their role is, how this connects with their own personal values in that, then I think we're doing a disservice. And again, it's engaging a lot of these people who are fearful, bringing them along in the conversation. If we're actually really serious, if we really want to create structural, sustainable change with individuals, that everybody needs to be engaged and have these sort of challenging, uncomfortable, difficult conversations.
And I think when we talk about bringing people along, like that's going to look different for different people, right? It's going to be just, again, to belabor our metaphor here about language learning. Some people are going to learn at a 101, some at a 201, some at a 301, and we need to really adjust our conversations and expectations around this because not everyone's had the opportunity to get, some of that foundational learning as well too. And so further to that consideration, how do we provide a space? And we talked about how, safe space is a bit of a troubling word. Like at Next Gen Men Equity Leaders, we use the term brave space, right? A space where you can challenge and be challenged. How do we create a brave space? Specifically, again, we're kind of in that male dominant space. So for male identified individuals to grow, challenge, explore, learn, and experience these conversations.
So one of the important things for people to remember is like you and your own internal department again can put out policies, can put out all these different like toss out a YouTube video and all that. Great. That's great. Education is great learning. The most where we see the fastest and the largest attitudinal behavioral shift is on that peer-to-peer level. So it is really great to say, here's our training, here's compliance, here's Earl, here's what we need to do, and here's how you can learn more, and here's how you can learn it and practice it. Great, amazing. But if we're not providing spaces for people to challenge each other, to bounce that around, to sort of learn off of each other, we're not going to see that significant attitudinal behavioral shift. I go in and host a lot of these spaces and workplaces to have a conversation. And it's not just from me at the front of the room saying like, hey, think about this different perspective. It's when Earl says something and Todd beside them is like, hey, I don't know, like that doesn't really land with me. Here's how it like sort of sorts out in my perspective in my life. And that's where you start to see the shift. Or someone makes a joke in a room and someone else says like, that's not funny. Here's why. And what you actually start to see there is someone click and be like, okay, that's not funny. Like this is the vibe is shifted in this room. And I have a lot of humor that I can offer. Maybe I need to offer it in healthier and safer ways or in a different track. Or you have people being like, walk out of that room being like, ooh, do I need to think about this from a different way or different perspective? And that's where we see the change. And so it's not enough just to offer a one-off training. It's about how do you create spaces for people to hold this regularly? So not just when we come in, but how do you actually create the sustainable structure within an organization that you can continue to have these conversations, you can continue to do that. And what's important about this is if we are really serious about people evolving, changing, and growing, then this is where it happens. It's not going to happen by a compliance video. It's not going to happen just with a health and safety meeting. It's going to happen by people, particularly men and male leaders, being able to challenge each other, be able to learn, be able to say, I think that's BS when we say, here's the new concept that we're starting to talk about. And someone say, I think that's stupid. And instead of being shunned and said, go home, the conversation is like, why do you think that's stupid? Unpack that more, say more. And then have other people in that room say like, this is why I don't think that's stupid. One of the example, and I know we've chatted about in a lot of forums, but I was in a workplace and pronouns are a really big thing. Trans movement pronouns are really, hot topic on present because it's a lot of political arena chatter about it. Someone in the workplace, a male leader was like, I don't get it. I was told I have to put the pronoun in my email signature. I just don't get it. And instead of saying, put it in or else, right? Like there was an edict in terms of saying everyone needs to do it. They never asked about it. And so they weren't coming about that saying like, I'm transphobic and all that. They're just being like, I don't get it. I don't think it's important. I don't buy into that, blah, 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 blah. And instead of me at the front of the room being like, hey, this is why, they had someone else in the room step up and say, hey, this is actually why it's not just important for you, but it's important for other members of your team and to know like for their family members or like create visibility so someone else feels that they can share. Like it was such an organic moment. And guess what? That guy left that room being like, I understand. I may not be the biggest champion. I may not be at 3.0 yet, but now I at least understand why. And it was because he was able to put his hand and say like, I think this is silly. And instead of being canceled, he was engaged and the conversation was had. That's the power of creating these spaces. And so if and workplaces are really serious about creating change, it can be feeling very daunting. It can feel very difficult. So lean into experienced facilitators to start that work and help you format that space. But that's where this type of attitudinal behavioral change happens. And that's where you start to set the culture of your workplace, being able to have like the psychological safety, these brave conversations where people can call each other in on their ever like lifelong journey.
And what I heard in that as well too, the colleague saying, hey, this is why it matters, right? Like if we have a little bit of privilege as, white men, or, maybe you're talking about race-based issues and you're a white woman in the workplace, or perhaps you're a able-bodied individual or those types of things, right? We have privilege so that we're not facing these types of things. It's not necessarily always burdening those individuals who don't have that privilege in your workplace to do that explaining and taking that privilege, not just for granted, but turning it into a responsibility of like, hey, this doesn't necessarily impact me, but I understand how it might impact others. So let me take this opportunity to explain to my peer who doesn't face that as well, around that. And baked into that is, what's going to serve people really well in their careers, period, full stop, not even around these issues, is a deep sense of curiosity and continual, lifelong learner growth journey, those types of things. And I think that that's missing from a lot of these conversations as well too, is a desire to understand the lived experiences of another.
It's really easy for us to sit in our bubble, whether that be our group of friends, our physical neighborhood that we're in, our section of the office that we work with, or even our team if we're out and deployed in a specific area. It's really easy, and that's natural, right? It is a natural grouping that we as humans do in that space, the affinity bond. But what's really important, if we really want to build that emotional intelligence, and as you said, like learning from other people's experience, be able to adapt better to your customers and understand them better, be a better leader because you understand different personas, perspectives, and working styles, we need to break ourselves out. And that requires work. That's not just going to roll up on your doorstep and do that. That means you have to start asking questions. A workplace session that we did a while ago we sent men home, male leaders home, with questions to ask their partners and other specific women on their team or on their floor wherever they're at. Not direct reports, other people. And there was some of them were sort of kooky questions, but the other ones were about their experiences with work, their experience with home, their things like that. And one of the things that really that was surprising to us, that these are not questions that they would normally ask. And they started to understand more about the career path of other people because it wasn't their own. So they're being like, oh, you got to get up, you got to do this, you got to talk to this person, this is the career progression, this is how things work, you got to go do this social event, all that. And they started talking to people who didn't have the same pathway as them in the office and started to be like, oh, my pathway is not the only pathway. There are other pathways to get there. I can manage these people differently. And so that's a gendered example. But it's also really important for men to sort of learn from other people, different lived experiences. You're going to talk to someone in one of these sessions, and you're going to maybe say something like, I don't get this, or something around pride, like we talked about last time. And guess what? Someone in that room is either going to be a member of the 2S LGBT community, or will have someone in their family or that they know, and they could say like, well, actually, this is not the experience, and this is why it's a challenge. And that person's going to sit back and be like, wow, because they're engaging someone and calling them in, and they want them to be better, and they want them to be part of their team. And so this is really where the power lies, is if one, it's a benefit to the organization. So organizations should lean into creating these spaces, not shy away from it. Stronger teams, I mean, we can go through the list of the KPIs where like we're higher performance, blah, 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 blah. But then to your point, this is actually where the next generation of leader really sets himself apart, by being able to read into the differences with different people and then evolve and adapt based on the perspectives that they're hearing. Now, you don't have to agree with everything that you hear, but now you have that data point to weigh out of all the data points that you have. And if you're not actually going out and trying to seek out the different perspectives from your peers and other people around the organization, you're not getting a full data set. So you're actually making incomplete assessments on what you need to be doing as a leader or in your own career. And so it's a benefit to the organization, but then also to the individual as well.
Awesome. So final words on creating space for growth. Any action items?
So if you're an individual, like this could be a scary thing for organizations to sort of jump into, right? Like I get that. It can be daunting. You don't want to create the space and have things go sideways or things come up, or you don't want to harm people. And so a few things, if we want to sort of close this off, is you want to create the space. As I mentioned before, culture is not policy, it's people. So that means you don't have to sit back and wait. You have to lean in. I mean, you can't just expect the right people to show up to your workplace. It's about seeking that out, setting that culture when they arrive, and setting that vibe when they do that. So it's also not about a single person, right? Like this isn't just about like Jim's a crappy manager or Carol's rude to me in the break room. Culture and psychological safety is about everything that encompasses around you in the workplace. It's about how people engage with each other. It doesn't mean that people walk out holding their hands and high-fiving at the end of every day. Like there could be tough conversations. People can leave upset, but they're able to do that in a healthy way. So if you're a leader, and your action item specifically at this point, whether it's up in your prerogative or your position to be able to hold these spaces, it's to just tip your toe in and start having soft conversations with someone else, being like, hey, what are your thoughts on? Hey, how did you experience this? Hey, what does that look like? Start practicing that skill. As I said with the language, you mean I don't go in and start firing up a full Spanish, like I'm not leading the orders at a restaurant, like right out of the way. Instead, it's me practicing sentences. So if you want to build your competency, these are the type of things you can do. And it takes some time, because the first time you do it, someone might be like, why are you talking to me about this? Right? Like, this is really like weird. And so everyone needs to practice. So I think that it's actually a really easy, tangible thing for everyone to do, is just small things like, what do you think about this? And it's not about getting political. It's just practicing how to have some of these uncomfortable conversations. If you're a leader and you're serious about doing this, this isn't DEI training. This is about competency for your team and your management. And so it is about leadership engagement, and leadership forward thinking. So that means engage professionals. So like equity leaders in the space, about creating the strategy, creating the space, and building the competency of your leaders to hold the space after they leave as well. So there's two tracks: individual, tip your toe in; organizational, find professionals in the space to help create these conversations.
Awesome. Love it. Now, if we were a real serious, podcast video, this is where we would, interject like an advertisement, maybe some music or whatever, but we don't have that. So we'll just jump into the next section to close us out here. And I wanted to, I had a little series on LinkedIn called Think About Thursdays, where I shared little tidbits from our latest card deck, Cards for Equity. And to your point, this is all about starting brave conversations about equity in workplaces. So for those who don't know, it's a deck of cards, conversation discussion prompts. As you see, the back of the cards have different colors, so there's different difficulties. Trevor, pick a card, any card. This one, how's that?
Good. Yeah,
That's great.
That's great.
And I just dropped them all, but I'll pick that up after. So there's 6 categories. Today's category that we're going to be diving into is intersectionality. And I got an intermediate color here. Trevor, what is the difference between focusing on someone's identities and focusing on the intersections of their identities?
So for me, I'm a male. I'm a cis male, cis white male. So I have a bunch of different things there. It could go a lot of other things in terms of like my queer identity, or the fact that I live in Toronto, or like there's a lot of things that sort of make up who I am. I've gone to PSC, yada yada yada. And so focus on the single, be like, you're male, or like that is your identity, you're male, and bucketing you there, without understanding all the other elements that actually make up who I am in terms of lived experiences or different aspects of what makes them identity. So like my identity as a male is radically different from your identity as a male, Jake. And so I think it's a disservice to just categorize or just think of someone in a single identity, because our lived experiences are radically different. And I'll let you tell your own story, but like if I look at mine and say like, we have the conversation with men and say, okay, like, man, like, tell me about, like, let's bring you back. Like, where did you go to school? What was your high school experience like? Where, not even talking about professional life later, high school experience, but like, what's your family makeup like? What type of house did you live in? Well, all these different things, like, did you have someone staying at home growing up, or did like, what is, and you go through and all of a sudden, no one's standing together. Everyone has very unique genetic makeups of their life and lived experience. And that makes you who you are. And so if you think about it in a workplace really briefly, it's also about very few people have the same experience. Like you may be a manager of sales, let's say. Okay, cool. There's a lot of other managers of sales, but your experience is also a unique makeup in that too. And then also your family experience, maybe your other life impacts. And so it's really difficult to, and I think it's an incredible disservice to any of us to just limit ourselves to any single identity, because it is such a unique DNA genetic makeup of our lived experiences.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think, it's such an opportunity for curiosity as well, too, right? And there's certain things, people will look at us and say, hey, those are 2 white men, right? And what kind of judgments come up with that? And, some of those judgments may be deserved, but I remember I was recently on a call or in a workshop or just having a conversation, and it was 3 white men, but very different lived experiences. Like you said, there was, myself, and I actually, my relationship with whiteness and kind of what that means in Canada, I think is a bit interesting for me and how I see the world. Like my family and I came to Canada as refugees in the early 1990s, right? And I was the kid who was in ESL till grade 3 and who brought food to school that people were like, oh, that's weird, right? And when you think about that, you often think about, people with racialized experiences. And absolutely, I will say that, my family benefited from our whiteness in integration and those types of things. But, people don't ask me, where are you really from? Right? So but I still see it so differently. And if someone just kind of robbed me of that lived experience by just saying, oh, well, you're a white man, I think they would miss a lot of richness of how I kind of see the world. And in this conversation, there was another individual who was a queer man, and the diversity that he had with that lived experience. There was another man who had a disability, and so, you know, I guess my call to action with that would be, you know, again, stay curious about people's different possible backgrounds and what makes them uniquely them. And absolutely, we need more representation and representative diversity. Like, our organizations should really reflect our communities, right? And so, you know, what modicums of diversity are we actually designing for there? And it's not just male, not just race, it's not just these other things, right? It's educational background, language experiences, different you know, work experiences as well too. So I think it's part of a rich fabric that makes up our lives.
I would just add one last thing for a lot of people who think this and be like, I don't see race, I don't see gender, I just want the best person for the job, and or I just want the best. Like I look at other qualifications, and you're like, well, I get that's BS. You should be looking at those things because those are all the unique identifiers. Like the things that make up who you are, how like what your value set is, how what your methodology for business and decision making is. Like that's the makeup. It's the same thing if you went in and told you mean I don't see age. I don't see age. And so all that and being like, well, you mean guess who flips the table on that one is the people who've been working there for 30 years and being like, well, what do you mean? You're just going to discount my 30 years experience? Well, like, I'm sorry, I don't see age. And so that is a really important part of your makeup and your experience. And so if we're thinking about intersectionality, we should be seeing all the intersecting parts of people's identities and not trying to just gloss it over and be like, I don't see it. You're just a blob to me. You're a human to me. Well, great. But that's not what we want. We want you to see all of us and our lived experiences and our perspectives, because that's what makes us unique and that's what makes us important.
Awesome. Love that. Great note to end on. You know, as you can see, one card just got us off on a really rich conversation. So definitely encourage you to grab your cards for equity at equityleaders.org. Trevor, till next time, we'll have more conversation and we'll have more caution about men at work. Ciao.
Cheers.